We are really pleased this morning to have special gentleman with us today. Jim Lewis is the U.S. Attorney for the Central District, and John Milhiser is the State's Attorney for Sangamon County. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and he can introduce however he wants to introduce. Here you go.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. You get more. If you thought you were just getting me, you're actually getting a lot more today because John came with me. I want to thank you in general for the Citizens Club, and I want to thank you specifically for inviting us today. I am a person who in my whole life and my whole career has tried to work for citizens to understand what's going on around them so that they can act, and so that they can act positively, because that's the only way we're going to have the society that we ought to have and that we say we want to have. And if you want to know about the society we say we want to have, take a minute in the near future and read simply the preamble to the United States Constitution. I read it regularly. It reminds me what we're supposed to do. So thank you very much. John and I, we sat down and we sort of discussed what we wanted to talk about. The truth is that in an hour we cannot explain what we necessarily do. But we can talk about some of the things that we do where we think we are serving a specific purpose to help make the community better and stronger. So we picked a few purposes. John is going to go first and talk for about 5 minutes, and then I'll cut him off. Then I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes with a PowerPoint. If Jimmy Henton, who's absolutely wonderful, can get the PowerPoint going. Then John is going to talk again about drug court and some of the alternative courts that they have going in the state system, because not everybody has to go through the criminal justice system. And John will talk about that for about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to talk for a longer period and try to explain to you the basics of a gun violence reduction program that we have going in Peoria, and changing, not just doing cases, but actually changing conditions in Peoria. So we have an ambitious agenda. Let's get going.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks to the Citizens Club for hosting these breakfasts. Thanks to Jim Lewis, our U.S. Attorney. Jim, thanks for all you've done throughout the years, and also as U.S. Attorney for what you do in our community. And thanks for inviting me to tag along. I'm honored to be here and join you on this stage and talk about such an important topic of, making our community safe and making our community the best it can be. That's my goal every day I go to work at the State's Attorney's Office. What can I do today to make this community the best it can be? And in my position as State's Attorney, that typically is, unfortunately, locking folks up. But that's not always what we have to do, and we're going to get in a little later to some other alternatives and things we do. Briefly, I am the Sangamon County State's Attorney. Every county in Illinois has a State's Attorney. I'm the county prosecutor. A little bit of a misnomer, State's Attorney. I'm the county prosecutor. From Hancock County down south, where it's just one State's Attorney, to Cook County up north, where Anita Alvarez has 1,000 assistants that work for her in Cook County. Here in Sangamon County, there are 28 assistants that work in my office, everything from juvenile court to a civil division to child support enforcement to traffic and misdemeanors, DUIs, and criminal felonies. So that's what we handle. Jim wanted me to talk about kind of the vulnerable populations and what we are doing to try to focus in those areas. And I thought of two, kind of the old and the young. The first is the elderly and what we do and partner to try to protect and if there are criminal laws being broken, to enforce violations against our elderly population. And we have what's called an M team. We work very closely with senior services. And to investigate, not only investigate, but make sure we prosecute and provide services to that population, whether it be elder fraud or physical abuse, all that abuse. And it's a very important population that we try to protect, and unfortunately, a vulnerable one. And oftentimes we see, very unfortunately, other family members that are taking money from their parents, their grandparents, their elderly relatives. So we investigate and do prosecute those cases. That's one. And then the young, the Child Advocacy Center. This month, the Child Advocacy Center celebrated its 25th anniversary in Sangamon County, the Sangamon County Child Advocacy Center. And what that does, and what that group does, the Advocacy Center, it is a way to coordinate the investigation and prosecution of child abuse cases, which unfortunately over the last 25 years, over 8,000 children have sought the services and provided the support and services through the CAC. We average 300 to 400 children that come through the CAC every year, and oftentimes, much like those elderly cases we have, there are family members that are committing these horrific crimes against these very, very young, fragile victims. So that's the CAC I have seen. It is very, very positive impact on these families. And what it does, there are advocates at the Child Advocacy Center that provide the support not only to the child victims, but the families. Because long after my office is done prosecuting the offenders, you know, that child has to live with what happened to him. So they provide the counseling, the services, the resources to those other treatment agencies to assist them. So those are two areas where we do what we can to affect those vulnerable populations, and there are more. But if the PowerPoint is working, which it looks like it is, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Lewis. Thanks.
Okay, investment frauds, we do those. Yeah, we have Ponzi schemes. All right, we got them. We don't have Bernie Madoff, but we have people that would like to get up to that level. All right. I gave a press conference on the issue of public corruption, and the Journal Register summarized what I had done, or what our office had done. By the way, let me explain something. I don't actually do the cases, all right? I just kind of preside. And make sure everybody gets paid on time and things like that. And I actually have people that help me make that happen, too. So we had this press conference, and we talked about the fact that we have been doing a lot of work on grant fraud, that the government, the state government had been sending money for very good purposes, education, job training, very necessary purposes. But the people, some of the people, a small number of the people that were getting it were keeping it essentially for themselves. So the SJR summarized it in an article which had the heading, editorial, No Public Corruption, Call the U.S. Attorney. And this is a public corruption case. Fraud related to a $1.25 million grant involving a suburban Chicago police chief and her husband. The police chief has been found guilty or pled guilty, I don't remember. We also do a lot of healthcare fraud. There's a Medicare fraud control unit that operates here. And in the city of Springfield, Cardinal Respiratory was doing a lot of that. They had to pay a lot of money, and the business manager went to jail for 9 years for healthcare fraud. Healthcare is such a large part of our economy, and therefore fraud in that, just like fraud in the money we send over for our wars, is an extremely important issue. Generally speaking, our office, which runs on a budget of about $6 million, collected about $10 million in money that's owed by people. Some of it was for fraud cases. A lot of it was also restitution that's ordered after criminal convictions, etc. I will tell you that the Justice Department, the U.S. Attorney's offices collect an amount equal or greater than what it costs to run them. We also protect the environment. We do a lot of things. This is a fish and wildlife case, but we do a lot of cases with EPA, making sure that the water systems are healthy in our communities. This was a very prominent duck hunter who decided, what if he violates all of the duck hunting rules? He'd be even more popular. Instead, he got himself in trouble. We've done a hate crime summit in East Peoria. We've done one in over in Urbana. We do a lot of civil rights enforcement of various kinds, disability rights, fair housing, and a number of civil rights matters.
So Jim now wanted me to talk about kind of some other diversion programs we have. And when some of them you maybe don't hear about, and some are in the works that you haven't heard about. But you typically hear the state's attorney's office when we prosecute criminal offenses. For example, this week we indicted, and it'll come out today, 3 individuals for a homicide that occurred back in January that was investigated by the Sheriff's Department, went to the grand jury this week, returned an indictment on first-degree murder for these 3 individuals. So that's typically what we do when you typically hear about those types of cases. And unfortunately, they do happen in our community, and they need to be prosecuted. But also, there are some other things we can do to, frankly, make our community better. And one is drug court, which was started 4 years ago this December. In December of 2010, we started a drug court. And the purpose of the drug court was to give nonviolent offenders an alternative. It's very focused, bring a lot of different community members, different resources together to help these drug-addicted individuals combat their addiction, with the hopes that in the long term it gets them off drugs, stops them from committing crimes, and makes our community safer and saves money. When we try to sell it to the county board, they are, and here in Sangamon County, pretty tight with a purse. So try to tell them, hey, look, this will benefit the county because less people in the jail. One, it's a giant pain in the butt to run a jail. It is very, very tough work, and the people in there are, the people that come into the jail aren't the most healthy to begin with. They haven't been taking care of themselves on the outside, or typically they wouldn't be in the jail. So it's a very difficult thing to do to run a jail. So if we can keep people out of the jail, it's much better. But we also need to make sure if they're out of the jail, they are not committing crimes. So the drug court started in December of 2010, and I would encourage anyone to come to our graduations. They're in April and October. And I don't have the date in October, but there will be a press release and it'll be announced. But it is a wonderful experience. It takes place in the county board chambers of the Sangamon County building, and it averages between 3 and 5 graduates every time, and they have to go through a very structured program with 3 different phases. Typically takes anywhere from 18 months to 2.5 years to get through it to graduate. But around the nation, if you look at recidivism rates for those that have gone through drug court, incredibly much, much better than those where you just send them to prison. Because that's the alternative. Our drug court is set up to go after those where nothing else has worked. Oftentimes they've been to prison before. Oftentimes they're multiple felony offenders. They've committed felony offenses before. Nonviolent. We don't take violent offenders in there. But you have retail theft, forgery, other property crimes, those types of offenses. And the court is kind of at its last straw. There's nothing else to do with these folks. Let's try drug court. This person, because they have this drug addiction, they're committing these offenses. So drug court has been very successful. We're also working towards a mental health court, and we hope to have that up and running within the next year. A little different, some similarities to the specialized court of a drug court, but a little different in that you're dealing with a population who has a mental illness. So it is not as easy as getting them to dry out and understand they have a drug problem and keep them off the drugs. Oftentimes with a mental illness, it is a lifetime thing of making sure they stay on their medication, they go to counseling, but around the country, our mental health courts are gaining in popularity, and have shown to be very, very successful. And for the last year, there's been a small group meeting, myself, somebody from probation or court services, also Jan Gamback, who's the president of Mental Health Centers of Central Illinois, who has been a wealth of information in trying to get a mental health court established. Also a veterans court. I went to a veterans court conference in Anaheim this past year, and it was a very rewarding experience to see these individuals who have been in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Vietnam. I found out that there's a large group of individuals that from the Vietnam era that came back from Vietnam, and we know how they were treated. Not the way they should have been treated. Then they went to work. They worked great with no trouble. Now they're reaching retirement age. And it's weird, at that retirement age, when they no longer have that focus of work, they are running into problems. But it relates back to their military service and what happened to them in Vietnam. So the Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and those folks to understand that they put their lives on the line and we owe them something. We can have this specialized court. And what's a little different about the Veterans Court is that it is based on a framework of mentors. So a big thing is recruiting mentors to mentor these individuals, to be with them. And that hopefully in the next couple of years will happen around here. And I bring it up and talk to people and they're like, what? I mean, we don't have a big problem around here. Well, we do. I mean, I see the reports, I talk to the folks, and every day we have individuals coming back who have seen horrific things and then trying to come back in society. And I think it's very, very difficult to do that, and we owe them something. So we will get that established in the next couple of years. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jim.
My second comment is that the federal system, particularly in Peoria, has a court that's very similar to the state drug court, and the statistics over the years are very interesting. They estimate that if we had put people through the criminal justice system and put them through prison as they were facing, we would have spent about $8.5 million. Instead, by putting them through an intensive treatment program, these were nonviolent, addicted people who got involved in federal crimes, drug crimes mostly, on a minor level, but still part of conspiracies. Instead of $8.5 million, actually spent about $657,000, so saved almost $8 million over the years. And we're all used to success rates, and they're usually kind of low. The success rate in the drug court that is run in the federal system is in the is just about high 85–90% effective. The people are intensely supervised, they get a lot of services, and lo and behold, they turn their lives around, married, educated, children, jobs in the community, businesses, all sorts of things happen as a result of the alternatives. But now I'm going to talk about something that's very significant to us, and it's the issue of gun violence reduction. Basically, I'm going to show you a video that was put together in Peoria. It's about 5 minutes as we started the program and as we hoped that it would work. And then I've given each of you, and I'm going to show, and I'm also going to put up on the screen, now we have about 2 years worth of results. And you will see results that reflect a community where there are significantly fewer shootings. That seems to me to be a good thing. And a community where fewer people get tangled up in the criminal justice system, which is an expensive system, and that seems to be good too. And the way it is basically accomplished is that there is a law enforcement focus on the truly worst in a proactive law enforcement effort, focusing on the truly the worst. And then there are others around the worst who have lesser members, and we have call-ins with those people. And as a matter of fact, the last couple of pages is what I said to a call-in group of 11 people who are gang affiliated and identified as potentially really serious problems. What I said to them Wednesday night in Peoria, and I'm one of about 10 speakers, and that's my message to them. There's a law enforcement message, and there's also a very strong community message. We want you to stay in the community, but you have to put down the gun. Don't shoot. That two-pronged effort, which is really a good focused law enforcement effort and a broader community effort to get the other people out of the gang life, it seems to be having some results up there. But it requires community understanding and it requires community support. But this is a strategy that actually works. It does include some strong law enforcement, as you'll see, but everybody you saw there, the mayor, the sheriff, the police chief, the police department, the elite program they have up there, everybody's on board, and we all participate in these call-ins and in planning the effort. So let's see. This is a map. They had a series of shootings in June and July of 2010. And what they did, and you can see the hot spot, what they did is they saturated it with police. And you can do that, and you can do that for a while, but it's very expensive, and after a while the police become essentially sort of an occupying group, and that really doesn't go well in the community. So this is an alternative. What we're talking about in the Don't Shoot effort is an alternative to saturation. But you can see what saturation can do. It can work. This is the Don't Shoot, and now we've had a couple of years of it, and it looks like the number of shooting victims is going down. The mayor describes this as cautious optimism, and you can't say that a strategy directly produces a result, but it's got some influence. At least you have to believe that it does. The shooting incidents are also down. The victims are down, but these are small numbers, so you can't necessarily conclude too much from that. This is the story of a group that was particularly the focus of law enforcement. I said to you there was strong law enforcement. There was a group called Bomb Squad, which, if you want to be in trouble, name your group Bomb Squad. And they got, there were a lot of state court prosecutions of Bomb Squad people, but this was the results of the federal prosecutions in a conspiracy case of 14 of them. And there are significant sentences, and these are people that just, if you're going to have a better community, there are some people that just need to get out of town for a while. And that's what this just shows you, that the federal side of it worked well. The state side did as well. But there was a focused effort on Bomb Squad. Then we sat down right after the focused effort on Bomb Squad and talked to members of the other gangs in our first call-in, and we specifically talked to Zone 4 members. And after we talked to the Zone 4 members, one of the former Zone 4 leaders came back to the community, and there was a power struggle within Zone 4, and they became a group that we had to focus on. So we've indicted 14 members of Zone 4, and the state courts have focused on that. And in the course of working, focusing on those people, lo and behold, solved a cold case murder. These are arrests of target gang members. There is good, strong law enforcement, and you'll notice, for instance, an armed robbery bond of $1 million. Now, that's a rather high bond, and that was a gentleman who we sat and talked with and said, you got to cut it out. Shortly after that, armed robbery. Shortly after that, he's arraigned, and he was kind of hoping maybe I'll be released on bond. But the explanation of the judge was, we've already talked to this person that he had to stop, and the bond was $1 million. Same thing with a robbery bond of $200,000. In other words, the state's attorney has made it his business to go in and argue for high bonds with people that we've already talked to and said, you got to put down the gun and you got to stop. More examples, lots and lots of state court prosecutions. Interesting effect. All right, and if you're interested in county budgets and local budgets, that's kind of interesting. And if you're interested in seeing fewer people go through the criminal justice system, just reserving it for the right people, interesting effect. Also, felony charges, and I hadn't sat down with the state's attorney and sort of asked him why, but there are fewer felony criminal charges. So I'm going to speculate, and my speculation is that by arresting and by focusing on and arresting the true drivers of crime and violence, and by putting out the community message that this stuff is not acceptable, something seems to have changed. Let's see. I don't know. It's 2 years in. This keeps track of, we keep track, the police department has somebody who will connect them to social services and make sure they get the services, because these are people that know the gang life.
You just mentioned the educational factor as a deterrent here for crime. The Department of Corrections for a number of years had an emphasis on educational programs. They created prison industries. They also created their own school system, had their own superintendent. Over the past few years, that has totally almost deteriorated to nothing. I think that's a good public policy in the Department of Corrections.
You answered your own question. You answered it.
Misinterpreted your comment. You started talking about this as a gun reduction problem, I thought. And I didn't hear anything really about how you're reducing guns. What are you doing?
We're not reducing the ownership of guns. We're not changing the gun laws. We're changing usage and the consequences of usage by groups and by most violent members of the community, because we're telling each of them that they will be the law enforcement focus. And then we follow up, and they are. And it has consequences. If you look at what I say in the, I got their attention on Wednesday night. There's a semicircle of the community and the law enforcement. There's a semicircle of the offenders that we called in. And then behind, there were about 80 or 90 members of the community listening because they were concerned. And I just pulled my chair up right in front of them and looked them in the eye in a way where they had to look me in the eye. And among the things you'll see that I said to them was that because of either high bond in the state courts or because of federal detention policies, that the day they are arrested is the last day they will be free until they complete their sentence 10, 15, 20 years into the future. That got their attention. Will it change their behavior? You know, that's up to them, but it gives them a good understanding on it. So it's changing their usage of guns.
So nothing at this point is being done to reduce the number of guns that are there or the availability.
We accept the gun laws as they are. Well, remember, most of the people, the people we're talking to all have criminal records. So if they had a gun in their house or on the street, that is a case that would be prosecuted.
Mr. Lewis, when you were talking about one of the areas that your office pursues, you were talking about grant fraud. Would that enter into the area of in what involves our sitting governor, and I think it's called NRI or something, where they shipped a whole bunch of money to Chicago and it was not used or wasted or both?
I expected that question, but from a different member of the audience. All right. It is government policy, for very good reasons, not to comment on whether we're investigating anything. All right? Sometimes we get forced off that position. So we have acknowledged that we did receive the Auditor General's report on the NRI initiative. And then I had to ask the State Legislative Investigating Commission, which has a genuine interest in this, and I asked them in essentially a private letter that is now public, if they would give us a little bit of time to look. And those are the things that are publicly known, and I have no intention of adding to the public record.
I have another question, but if you want to come back to me, it's actually for both you and John.
This Don't Shoot Peoria, is this a program that could be replicated and created right here in beautiful downtown Springfield?
Oh, thank you. And because I'm about to suggest to you something you want to read, a book by David Kennedy mentioned in it called Don't Shoot. It is good reading. This is not rocket science, and it was not developed purely in Peoria. And David Kennedy, by the way, has been to Peoria a couple of times. And we had a statewide gun conference with the Northern District of Illinois, the Southern District of Illinois, and the Central District last September, and David Kennedy was there too. This has been done from Boston to Stockton, California. This is being done in some neighborhoods in Chicago, and those neighborhoods are doing better than where it isn't being done. This is heavily done in High Point and in about 14 sites in North Carolina. It's being promoted in Connecticut. It is national. When all the U.S. attorneys got together in November 2011, this was an hour and a half or 2-hour subject for us. We are all encouraged to do it. It could be done. It takes work and effort, but if you like what seem to be the results from Boston to California, it's worth doing.
But where would one start? Who would one have to speak to get this rolling?
I ought to be part of the conversation, and okay, all right. But you pull together, what you pull together is some law enforcement and some community, and you just say, are you interested? Are you interested in the hard work? And then we get some help from Peoria or from David Kennedy at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and we put together a program. We have an attorney in Peoria who was a national coordinator of things like this. The outside expertise is available. It is an issue of community will.
I compliment you in terms of what you've done.
I compliment you.
In looking at Peoria, it certainly has had an effect. But let's remember a couple things. His budget as Simon County State's Attorney is much different than his budget as a U.S. Attorney. So that as you look at the program, what's very important is resources. And what they're doing in Peoria is, rather than prosecuting at the state level, is going after at the federal level, which involves much heavier prison time, and the cases that are put together are much better. One of the things, if you didn't pick up on this, in Peoria, what the chief of police said was they have 16 officers and a sergeant assigned to a special unit. 16 officers and a sergeant. If we had 16 officers and a sergeant assigned to a unit here in the city of Springfield, it would be a much different situation.
Can I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because those aren't 16 new officers. They simply took their vice unit and their major crimes unit and redefined it. They did not add to the size of the police department. It's really more a targeting of existing resources. It's not a question, actually, of new money.
But again, it is a matter of resources and being able to use that. So that if we were to, here in the city of Springfield, poll approximately 16 officers and a sergeant, that would be coming out of our existing manpower.
May I say something?
That would be very, very difficult to do. Now, I do want to make one other point, if I could. We recently had a rash of shootings here in the city of Springfield. And we pulled everybody together, including the U.S. Attorney's Office, the State's Attorney's Office. But one of the things we also were able to do was to pull in the State Police Tactical Unit. And when we did that, we had a tactical member of the State Police with a member of the Springfield Police Department, and we saturated. What happened? No more shootings. Now, saturation is something that does work, but it's also a matter of manpower and resources.
An interesting effect, and this is why it's part of a much longer conversation. I'll tell you, I talked about High Point. High Point used to have 16 homicides a year. They now, over the last 14 years, have been averaging 4 homicides. That actually, if you stop and think about it, means that the police department can have fewer homicide investigators. If you drive down the number of prosecutions, you drive down the number of people in your jails, and you focus on really the worst with the resources that already exist, you may end up actually netting or holding your own financially. I don't know. That's part of a conversation. Well, let me go.
The money over and above your budget,
it goes into the Treasury. And I've never asked what happens afterwards.
It disappears.
No. It gets reused somehow by somebody.
Jim, may I make my last comment, and that is that the longest journey begins with the first step, so you can take that however you want for here in Springfield.
Yeah.
Just a more general question on public corruption, because it's often you've got have public corruption that might involve multiple jurisdictions and state and federal law. How does it get sorted out whether a case is being handled by a state's attorney or the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Northern District or the Central District? Because that's often people are saying, well, why didn't the state's attorney do this, or why didn't somebody else do it?
That's very good. The state's attorney in Peoria says to the offenders, for instance, as he said last Wednesday night, that they sit down with the federal prosecutors and the state prosecutors, sit down every Thursday and sort of sort things out. There is that same kind of communication between the federal prosecutors here and the state prosecutors here. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of the violence matters, the state penalties may be higher. And so those cases ought to be in the state system. So that part of it kind of works out. Then you sort of asked me, what about corruption? The truth of the matter is that the Northern District puts a lot of effort into public corruption. We do too. And I spent yesterday with the U.S. Attorney from the Southern District, and they put a lot of effort into corruption, particularly in around law enforcement and public leadership in and around East St. Louis. They have terrible trouble with the police departments down there and the city leaderships down there. And so the truth is we're all engaged. And you asked me sort of an interesting question, which is, what if somebody comes from the Southern District or the Northern District, comes to Springfield, gets a grant, and goes and does bad things with it or puts it in their bank account in the Southern District or the Northern District? We probably have criminal jurisdiction, and so would the other district. And so we just have to figure it out between the districts who's going to do that particular matter.
I noticed that one of the tools you was using that seemed to be very effective is having high bonds for people not to get back on the street. But I can't help but see a conspiracy theory in this. As a black man, and justice system may not work well for me, and I think if I would end up getting arrested, what is to say I'm going to get a fair treatment if I'm caught up with a high bond and not been able to defend myself?
David, you want to read David Kennedy's book, because about halfway through the book he realizes the impact of race on all of this. The person who got the $1 million bond was, whether that person was white or black, that person was doing regular damage and leading the damage in the city of Peoria. And disabling him and detaining him helped his immediate neighborhood, all the people that live around him, all the people that he was harming. That happens. The high bond is not a general practice. It is simply that if we have specifically sat down with somebody and said, here is the long list of things you've been convicted of, here is the long list of things we know you have been doing, you need to stop. And only after that, they will say to the judge, here's the long record, here's what else we know, we sat down with him, he will not stop. That person may get a high bond.
One more.
Mr. Lewis, this is actually for both you and John, because John mentioned a recent grand jury indictment. Now, I have, as I suspect many others in this room, have been impaneled on I think they're called pettit juries, where you try a case. I have never been on a grand jury. In fact, I don't think I know anybody who's been on a grand jury.
I do.
Well, yeah, you do. But I certainly don't know anybody who's ever been on a federal jury, grand or otherwise. I wonder if both of you could give me a little idea of where those come from or how you select them.
That's a broad subject. Maybe we ought to talk to you a little bit off it. But I do want to go back to Rich's point, which is part of what actually happens if you go to the community and why the African American community supports this effort is that you're saying two things to them, or more than two things. You're saying the people who are really tearing up your neighborhood and the whole city, we will prosecute them. And we will make an effort beyond them to make sure and do everything we can in our power so that nobody else goes in that direction. So at the call-in in Peoria, we had like 40 or 50 posters on the wall. And we constantly are saying to these people, and they know they are in the middle of the gang life, we said, do not become a poster on the wall. And that actually leads to a certain amount of community reconciliation with the police, because the police are focusing on the truest of the damage, and they are trying to make sure no one else gets into state or federal prison. That's actually, you need to read David Kennedy, and you and I may need to talk some more. But there is an element, and David Kennedy talks about it in his book, there is an element of racial reconciliation through an effort like this.